Greg, as a part of the AICC's Leadership in Focus series, can you please tell us a little bit about ASIC's relationship with the AICC and how you started out with the Chamber?
Well, look, ASIC's relationship with the AICC goes back many years to prior chairs, but includes myself. I've actually addressed a number of your boardroom lunches the last few years. So clearly we have a regular dialogue. Unfortunately, I've never succeeded in having time to go on a trade mission that I think you sponsor, but I have been asked to do that. I'd love to do that. I have been to Israel, so and a big supporter of Israel. And that probably also goes back to my days as Mayor of Wallara, where obviously I had a very significant relationship with our Jewish community and actually very good relationship with Mendel Castell at supporting his Jewish House cause, for example. So yeah, it's on both a personal and ASIC level, I think a very important relationship.
Thank you. In your recent speech to the University of Melbourne on the value of leadership, you mentioned today is all about leaders. So what guidance do you have for other CEOs and chairmen on being a leader in today's challenging times?
Look, I think today it is challenging to be a leader in challenging times, and when times are good and profits are good. In some ways, actually, when all that's going is when you actually have to be a good leader, because sometimes you have to change direction to, perhaps build a more resilient business. So I think the qualities of a leader in difficult times is being not afraid to take tough decisions. I think that's important. I think also making sure that you've got a good culture, and that good culture starts at the top. Making sure that the culture is that it's all about the customer and doing the right thing by the customer, being a customer-driven company, if that's what your focus is. It's certainly ASIC's focus, I think is important. But probably the four most important things, I think, and certainly the way I've approached ASIC, is one, is to have a very clear strategy and to make sure that strategy actually rolls down throughout the organisation. So essentially, you're all rowing in the same direction. Secondly, is to make sure you have very good communication from top to bottom, so there is no doubt about the strategy and how you do things, and if there's problems that they come up. I think the third thing that's important in a good organisation is accountability and sanctions. But going along with that is probably the fourth thing, is to make sure you have empowerment. I've never been a micromanager. I actually believe in people having clear goals, but equally there being good accountability and empowerment. And I think that is important. Another thing I mentioned in that speech the other day is what I see as the qualities of a good leader. And I think they're threefold. One is often it's actually about the character, and most importantly, often the best leaders are those perhaps who have failed and recovered and actually can empathise with people that, when you don't succeed, in fact, there are reasons. And I think that sometimes that makes for a very good leader. I think the second thing that's important is actually as a quality, is actually the ability to work as a team. At the end of the day, unless you can work as a team, you will never achieve anything. So I think that is quite important.
You touched on culture there, and there's been a mixed reaction to your plans to implicate company culture in an employee's wrongdoing. What are your thoughts on how corporate culture plays a big role in infringements to their legal requirements?
Look, at the end of the day, I believe that if you think about companies are no more than the sum of their people, and people are driven by behaviour. So if we want to often deal with a company's behaviour, really what you're talking about, the sum of that is the sum of the people and its culture. And what we realise is that, culture is a very important driver of conduct as a conduct regulator. So what we've been saying to companies is that, when we go out and do surveillance, a very big red flag to us is that if we see essentially a culture of non-compliance, that obviously triggers a red flag for us in terms of our enforcement activities. So I guess what we actually say is that if you want, we have a carrot and a stick approach. The carrot is when we see poor culture within an organisation, it's important that we elevate our concerns to the top to make sure that they're aware perhaps there's a problem, because sometimes, as I said before, communication sometimes doesn't flow down. So it's important that we alert them to problems, and we try and work with them to get a better culture and a better outcome if it's not achieving it. And I think that's an important stick. And we actually say to companies what we call the 3 C's, which is to make sure that, again, culture is communicated from the top, that it's constantly challenged to make sure you do believe that your culture is achieving the right outcomes that you want from the organisation, and that you never are complacent. Equally, if you want the stick, is to basically think about how we target our surveillance, but also making sure that the law, sometimes people are driven by deterrence. So it actually means that we will enforce the law, and making sure that we have, first of all, penalties that actually deter poor behaviour. And that's why also we've said, maybe we've got to think about, it's sometimes not just about the bad apples on the front line. At some point, if you have so many bad apples, there must be a problem with the tree. And we're saying, how do we address the issue of the tree? And this is something that we're seeing around the world at the moment. In the UK, you've got the responsible manager regime where they're saying, well, hold on, managers have got to be accountable. So this is not necessarily about holding boards of directors responsible. It's about really holding managers responsible. And I think that's quite important. And looking at making sure you've got the right incentives in place.
You've often been described as a creative banker. What is the importance of creativity in the world of finance, particularly when it comes to large-scale economic decisions?
Well, as a banker, where you make money is frankly a couple of things. If you always want to be looking at emerging trends. Okay, we've got to be a bit like a regulator in a way. You've got to be proactive and forward-looking. You've got to be watching what's happening around the world, where the trends are, to identify opportunities. That's if you want to be a good banker. And listening to your customers. Listening is very important. Listening. I used to spend a lot of time when I was a banker sitting down trying to understand my customer's business to see where I can. So rather than going with a pre-packed solution, actually listening and see what their problem is, that's important. I think the other thing that's important as a banker is execution. It's great to come up with ideas, but if you can't close, then that's deadly. So I used to see that in banking a lot, those that came up with great ideas but they couldn't close. So execution and timeliness, because the quicker you close a deal, you always minimise the unexpected. And I always used to say that to my teams around the world. But I do think the fundamentals are, if you want to build a resilient business, it's actually about being creative and execution, etc. But also simplicity. Simplicity, I think, is really, really key. If you're really good at something, you should be able to actually explain it very simply. The solution, often the most simplest things, often sometimes the most creative. So I'm about resilience, simplicity, and creativity.
What role do you see ASIC playing in opening up the market to entrepreneurialism and disruption?
Well, at the end of the day, as a market regulator, I see our fundamental objective being to help the market do its job, which is to fund the real economy and therefore economic growth. And I think that benefits everyone. So with that, if you want vision in mind, really the major way we try and do that is making sure that investors and issuers in markets have got trust and confidence, because if you don't have trust and confidence and people don't participate, you don't have a market. Okay, so I see digital disruption as an amazing opportunity to facilitate trust and confidence, to bring value to consumers and investors, and also, to make the economy more efficient. So my focus, or our focus, is to allow business to try and harvest that great opportunity while obviously mitigating the risk, making sure that we never actually threaten trust and confidence. So the outcome we're looking for is always the same, making sure that we can underpin trust and confidence. And that's why one of the things I announced that we launched earlier in the year is an innovation hub, so that we can try and facilitate new ideas. And I think that is important, to have a culture where we're receptive to new ideas coming to us, because we do have flexibility. We can issue relief in compliance with the law. We can issue class holds. So there are things we can do. To the extent legally we can't do them, it's a matter of then providing advice to the government. But we are, if you want to call it, we're open for business.
Do you think that Israel has been a global leader in the innovation space?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I must say, I was very impressed last year when I went to the Australian Davos Forum, and I met the gentleman behind our crowdfunding, and he presented on Israel, and it was just stunning. In fact, I've got a book, I think, called Digital Disruptive Nation or something like that. Startup Nation, great book, very exciting. And the numbers were really impressive in terms of the number of IPOs on the NASDAQ that come out of Israel. I mean, I think it's a great benchmark for any country. I think for our country, as a small country, what you can export, having ideas and being able to export them, and having a culture which allows people to take risk. You know, at the end of the day, market regulators are not opposed to people taking risk. I mean, we want, we've got to enable risk, taking more risk. It's about making sure that it's done, making sure people have trust and confidence, because if you take risk, you can win big, you can lose big. Ours is about just making sure that it essentially is done within people who understand what they're doing. So I do think what Israel's doing, I think, is frankly fabulous. And some of the innovations, some of it I think is still a bit of an untold story, frankly. And I'm very enthusiastic about it. In fact, I've actually had the gentleman from our crowd, actually I invited him to last year's IOSCO annual meeting in Rio to talk to the world's market regulators about what he's doing with crowdfunding, which I think his model in particular, I think is a great model. And he has funded some startups here in Australia.
When it comes to corporate responsibility and culture, what role do you find that mentorship plays?
Look, I think mentorship is very important. As I said, culture is important, and mentorship, I think, can actually help guide the right culture. So, and I do think often that starts from the top. And often, if it's within an organisation, having senior people, and I mentor staff in ASIC, and so do other commissioners. We actually mentor high potential women within the organisation, but also men are mentored. So I think mentoring is quite important internally, but then I think externally, even for CEOs, I think it's important to have a mentor, a trusted, wise person they can talk to. You know, if you think about the idea of mentoring goes back centuries, thousands of years of having a wise person you can seek guidance from, and I think that is a good thing. You shouldn't ever be reluctant to actually ask for advice. Whoever you are, I think it's important, frankly.
What about the role of networking organisations like the AIC? What role do they play?
Oh, look, I think networking organisations are very important. Having co-founded the American Securitization Forum, something like 15 years ago, which I was very proud of, it was quite interesting because in the securitization industry in the United States, $1 trillion industry, we had no industry group. And I've been very involved in the Australian Securitization Forum, and it was quite interesting. I said, well, we are competitors, but equally we have a common purpose, which is this industry is what actually helps, it actually gives us an income, and I succeeded in forming that group. And I think your group, probably similar to the American Securitization Forum, we had 3 focuses, what I call ACE: advocacy, consensus, or networking, and education. And many industry groups have either 3 or 1 or whatever of those. And I think industry groups are very important. I think the advocacy aspect is always obviously important. Your common cause and being able to put your position, I think is very important. Have one voice that can speak on behalf of you. I do think if you want the consensus and the networking, coming together, sharing ideas, that networking, our conferences at the American Forum we would normally have about 7,500 people attend our annual forum, which not only was a conference, it was also a marketplace where you would do deals, right? But it's actually, think about it again, it's that common thing of coming together in a marketplace, right? And then thirdly is education, making sure that, in our case, is making sure that if we wanted to be a responsible industry, making sure that we set our own industry standards and that we educated those that were coming up in the industry in the best practices in terms of our industry. So I think organisations, I think industry groups are very useful. And when I came back to Australia, I was Chief Executive of the Australian Securitisation Forum. So I guess I've actually had experience on the other side significantly.
So being the co-founder and chairman of the American Securitisation Forum and Australian, what are the greatest things you learnt from that experience?
Oh, I think the greatest things I've learnt is that as an industry group, equally you've got to be proactive and forward-looking, and you've got to be, again, it's like running a business. You've got to be focusing on emerging risks and trends, and you've got to be ahead of the game. And sometimes that's not easy. It's not easy. Sometimes if you're in a very large industry group and you've got dispersed interests, it's like being in a single church, many different sort of sub-themes, and often the challenge is to try and get a consensus. But I think often it's about saying, well, unless we do something, actually someone outside of us will do something that has unintended consequences. So sometimes it's better to come together to achieve an outcome that maybe we don't all completely agree on, but maybe better than something imposed externally. And I do think that's an important thing I learned, that sometimes you can't, as an industry group, if it's so fragmented, you can't get consensus. You end up with, I often think, a suboptimal outcome, which is governments impose solutions which often are not informed. So, and sometimes it's actually a function of not even. It's just difficult if it's so fragmented to just get that agreement. But I do believe that industry often led solutions and even sort of co-regulation, I think, is quite good at times where regulators can work with industry in a co-regulatory solution. Sometimes they need that hook to give them some power. Which I think is quite important. So, yeah, look, I'm actually quite a big fan of good industries, particularly what I call co-regulation. I think concept of self-regulation probably is a little hard, but I think co-regulation is not a bad idea.
What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the Australian finance industry today?
Look, I think Australia or globally, I think. Having been in the finance industry for over 3 decades, I used to think every year was a challenge, but now in particular, you've got some mega trends which I think are really important shaping industry. So clearly digitisation, and along with it, cyber resilience. I think you can't talk about digitisation without thinking about cyber resilience, those two together, opportunities and risks. Secondly, structural change, which is basically savings are moving out of the banking system into the funds management system as a result of retirement savings accumulating away from banks. And most of that is in capital markets, which is what we regulate, whether it be debt, equity, capital markets or funds management. And also you're getting structural change in itself driven by digitisation. There's more coming into the markets. The third one is clearly globalisation, and these all intersect, right? But globalisation's a fact of life. It's just going to continue. And then probably a fourth thing, I think, at the moment, I think, is the issue of longevity risk in financial services. People are living longer, and what does that mean for retirement savings, adequacy of retirement savings, financial products, etc. And one that's sort of now starting to come onto the radar as a business risk, I do think, is climate change. I think how the finance industry perhaps thinks about that risk, affecting it. I think more and more people will be thinking about. So, but as I say, there's top 3, I think, and they intersect with one another. And I do think for banks in particular, I think at the end of the day, the biggest strength they have is their customer trust. And I think the one thing that they need to remember is their customer trust, because they may not necessarily fund the asset in the future, but they may be the originator of that asset and they may be the manager of the asset, because what they're also good at is credit. So I think that will, I think banks will continue to do credit, I think they'll continue to have a relationship with customers. Whether in fact they are actually the funder of the asset in the future may change. So, I do think we're going to see significant change. And I guess at the end of the day, more and more will come into markets away from necessarily the banking sector.
People are taking on more debt with their investments, and there is talk of a potential housing bubble, particularly in Sydney. What can Australia do to combat this highly leveraged approach to investment?
Look, I've said before that on this is that, and I've said quite early in the piece, that my issue about housing prices is most important, as you know, with markets, is it really doesn't matter where you buy in a cycle, right? If you're a long-term holder, often you get some of the best properties in the market in a rising market, okay? But if you tend to be a long-term holder, you can be comfortable, but also equally, as long as you can afford to repay the debt. It's actually about making sure that you're realistic in terms of what you think is your ability to repay. In terms of the stress rate you put against the interest rate, it's not 4%, it probably should be 7%. Equally, you make sure that you're comfortable, your income, etc., to service it. So servicing the debt and taking a long-term view are fundamentals. In terms of the sort of bigger issue, I must say, having lived unfortunately through various property bubbles and having financed mortgages all over the world, different markets around the world, as my previous role as head of securitization. It's quite interesting that the lessons of history is that often you don't know you're in a bubble until it's over. And I think, people need to think about that. As I said, though, it's still the fundamentals of the property, but remember, if you look at history, it is interesting how average incomes to average house prices often basically come back to about 4 times. So it is quite interesting statistic. Now, there can probably be debates about that. And again, even if you're not concerned about that, I think the key is you just make sure that you can afford to pay the mortgage at a realistic rate. That's the main thing.
You're from a working class background and were the first person in your family to finish school. How do you think this has influenced your approach to life, and in particular, the value of education?
Well, education is the key foundation. The key building block was for me. I remember I was so excited when finally university education was made free, and I had the opportunity to go to. And I was in that early years of when it was first made free. And it was very exciting for us working class kids going to university. But that was the building block, I think, of getting an education. It gets you a great opportunity to get you through the door. I think after that, what I learned is, frankly, it's actually about hard work, being disciplined, being focused, having a strategy and a vision for what you want to do. But it is, frankly, at the end of the day, often it's about essentially, sometimes, as I said in my speech the other day, it's about, learning from failure on the way up and learning, shaping how you approach things. You learn a lot from, frankly, I remember the first time I had a deal go wrong, a debt, when I had to recover a loan, and the banker said, that's the greatest experience you can have, is actually having a loan go bad and having to get the money back. And I think you learn. So I think education is a foundation, but frankly, it's about education, but equally it's about hard work, personal discipline, and actually self-motivation. You know what? Life goes to those that you got to do it yourself, and basically, as they always say, it's back to the person concerned to take advantage of whatever. Sometimes it's luck, but also part of it just taking advantage of opportunities that are presented to you.
Your 5-year term as chairman of ASIC wraps up in May next year. So have you achieved everything that you set out to in that role? What have you been most proud of, and what is on the horizon for you after this role comes to an end?
Look, well, I didn't expect to get this. This was not what I planned for in life. But as I said, you do the best of what you have in life, and that's what I've done my whole life. So when I suddenly discovered I was becoming chairman of ASIC, great opportunity, really exciting. Frankly, I've just taken the approach to do the best that I can with what I have. And to that extent, internally at ASIC, I think that we've developed a very clear strategy about how we want to do things or how we do things, and making sure we've communicated that to those that we regulate, I think is important. Making sure that the strategy is integrated through to the business plans and the performance management, and that is the case we have today. Making sure that the staff are empowered. When I first came, we used to manage through headcount. Now we manage through budgets and dollars. I don't micromanage that, but no one's allowed to go over budget. It's important. We have the 3 Bs. Your business plan, your budget, and also your behaviour. And our behaviours are really important. You know, our values, as I said, accountability, professionalism, teamwork are the values that we set when I became chairman. So making it simple, that I can repeat them, the people can repeat them, because they're the people, the team, are the drivers of the outcomes that we get at ASIC. So that's important. I think externally, I guess what I've tried to do is, have tried to be proactive and forward-looking with ASIC and try to call out where I see issues, because I think you've got to be courageous if you want to be a good regulator, and you've got a wonderful opportunity. That's what I've certainly sought to do. Also, as part of that, I think the financial system inquiry, I think we would hope some of the recommendations will bring a more resilient ASIC. So I think a user pays funding model, I think, will be important. I think when we think about digital, I think we need, one of the proposals to have more flexible tools to handle the future. And there, I think there's a recommendation for a product intervention power rather than essentially something that's more flexible if we see a real problem. Allow things to operate more freely, but have the ability to step in if they need to. I think that's important. The other thing was penalties, and there was a recommendation there in the inquiry about penalties, and I think that's important. Making sure you've got the right level of deterrence is important in a free market to do those who do the wrong thing. Also, I think one of the other things I've been a big fan on as a small market, mutual recognition, and the Asian Funds Passport the government's doing there, we're helping to support that. Also, mutual recognition with the United States in debt markets. I'm a big fan of that. So, I think it's a continuum being at ASIC. You're a custodian for a short time, and just making sure you do the best you can with the resources you have, I think, is critical. Equally, at the IOSCO, the global body representing that 120 countries, was getting re-elected to that, was very positive there. What we've done is change the constitution so that the members of the board are more dynamic, such that it represents now the largest markets, and that the constitution will mean that in the future, as the smaller markets emerge and become in the top 20, today's ones will drop off. And that's a big change. So it means tomorrow's economies will be accommodated so it remains relevant. Making sure we've actually changed the funding to focus more on providing technical assistance to developing countries, the growth in emerging markets. So that's something I've done at IOSCO. So look, I've, as I say, done the best with what I have, and that's. So my next thing, frankly, we shall see. I retired from Wall Street, 8 years ago, thinking that was it. Life is a series of. Actually, I watched the Ita Buttrose interview last week, and I thought her description, climbing a series of mountains, and I think that's what life's all about. I like climbing mountains, and let's see what the next mountain may be.
Greg, thank you so much for your time.
It's great. Thanks, Charles.